Can you see that?
Yes.
Perfect. Does it work if I zoom in?
That works indeed.
Great. So, yep. Do you want me to start?
Sure.
Okie dokie.
You
So,
have the
hi,
stage.
Sorry?
You have the stage.
Thank you. Okay, anyway, hi, I'm Julianne Kiely. I'm a paleobotanist from the UK, and I'm not talking about a plant today. I am talking about Prototaxites, which we will see what it is. Anyway, so just a brief introduction to Prototaxites. Prototaxites is a morphotaxon, so a shape taxon of weird trunks from the Ordovician to the Devonian, which were often incredibly large in size. Most of them ranged from are about a foot in diameter, but they could get up to a meter across, which is absolutely massive. They were the largest organisms of their time, at least for the first 2/3 of their existence. At a time when the surrounding foliage was composed of basically bryophytes, so mosses, and the earliest land plants, all of which probably only grew up to a maximum of maybe a meter. But yeah, they are known from mostly the Northern Hemisphere, but there are some Southern Hemisphere ones, like in Australia. However, this might also be a sampling bias, considering that they are mostly found in localities which have a good history of paleontological research. But yeah, they are of uncertain taxonomic affinities, and that is probably the main reason that, at least within the literature, they are interesting. We have had so many arguments about what they are. So, just a very brief history of Prototaxites. They were originally discovered in the first half of the 1800s by Logan from Gaspe Bay in Canada. And the specimens were later gifted to Dawson, who then described them as rotting conifer logs in 1857. In cross-section, Prototaxites trunks have very obvious rings, a bit like the annular rings of trees, which is funny considering the previous talk. Anyway, so the first species and the genus was named in 1859 by Dawson as Prototaxites logani, and it was placed in taxonomy, so he thought that it was a conifer tree similar to a yew tree, hence the name. For the next couple of decades, he gave multiple talks and presentations and wrote papers describing these as conifer logs from these very, very early rocks from Canada. And he eventually gifted some specimens to Carruthers, who was a British researcher. Carruthers disagreed with this interpretation and assigned them to green algae, while also trying to give them a new name, which was invalid, which was Nematophycus. However, he did note that their anatomy was very similar to Lawsonia, which was a tree-like brown algae known from New Zealand at the time. In the coming years, the brown algae identity became the consensus identity. That's what most researchers thought it was, and that continued to persist for the next century and a bit. It was argued against. Dawson continued to argue that it was a conifer or a plant, and in 1888 tried to rename it as Nematophyton, and provided us with this first reconstruction of it, which is, again, very tree-like. He noticed scars on the trunks, which he said were the bases of leaves, which basically surrounded the trunk. But he was immediately ignored. Like, even his co-author the next year on a book immediately ignored that and proposed and placed it back in the brown algae. It was first potentially suggested to be a fungi by Church, who made comparisons to large woody fungi around today. But in general, the brown algae hypothesis persisted for until 2000. But yeah, in between, red algae was suggested as an identity first by Jonker, who noted features but placed it within brown algae, and then actually was classed within the red algae by Schweitzer in 1983, who also synonymized it with Macellophyton, these weird branching structures, and suggested that it was basically a large kelp-like algae. He later suggested it, but also suggested it was brown algae in 2000. This viewpoint of it being an alga changed in 2001 when Huber revised the taxonomic history and the morphology, its anatomy, and suggested that it was instead a basidiomycete fungi, so the same group of fungi which all of your classic toadstools and mushrooms belong to. And that view of it being a mushroom persisted basically until today. You got a couple of blips, like someone, like most noticeably Graham et al. Suggested that it was a rolled liverwort mat. Basically, mats of liverworts would roll down hills or get blown away or washed by water. They would roll up, and their rootlets would basically attach themselves to each other and cause these quote-unquote trunks, which were just rolled mats. But that was immediately disproven by multiple papers, but most notably Taylor et al., and that was 5 months after it got published. So yeah, we still, in general, until nowadays, thought it was a fungus. Or, as Retlack and Landing suggested, it could have been a lichen. So an organism made up of fungal cells which trapped algal cells within it and photosynthesized. And yeah, other more specific identities, such as changing it to ascomycete fungi, which is which is the other major group of modern fungi, have been suggested. And in 2003, studies and comparisons to the rhizomorphs of modern fungi suggested that it might have been just a giant rhizomorph. Instead of growing as a trunk, which had previously been the interpretation, it grew along the ground. I'll discuss that a bit more later. And yeah, fungus or lichen seemed to be the general consensus until literally about 2 or 3 weeks ago, when Lauren et al. Published, or at least it's still a preprint, found no evidence for that. They did chemical comparisons from Prototaxites Tate from the Rhynie chert, and Rhynie chert has exceptional preservation. They compared the chemical composition of Tate to other fungi and plants and invertebrates from the Rhynie chert, and found that it was completely unlike any of them. They also reviewed the anatomy and found that it had no fungal affinities, and so they suggested that instead it was a giant extinct eukaryote of basically just a nucleate. And now we come to today. So basically, this inspired me to take a look at it and just have a look and see if we can actually even restore it, which we may be able to. So this is my updated restoration of it, of specifically Prototaxites lugani. This was the original species, and one of the early specimens Dawson found was the Shunnamunk tree, which again was from Canada. This was a 8.83 meter long trunk with ridges all the way along it, and 1 meter long branches at the top. Unfortunately, only the top about 2 meters was retrieved and is preserved. Unfortunately, all the branches basically just crumbled to dust. They were not collected, but we have a single photograph of them. Yeah, it seems to be based on this tree, based on this specimen, that it had meter-long branches, which were about 10 centimeters in diameter, which had very, very high angles. They would have been very close to the trunk. arranged, and they were arranged around the top, about 1 meter of the trunk, in a very disorderly pattern. It's not like a plant, it was very disorderly, it's kind of random, they couldn't find a distinct pattern. But these trunks, based on the original photographs and some new specimens they found, would have been very, very finely ridged, or based on Prototaxites and onigiri, they may have been basically overlapping plates. But yeah, this is very similar to Retlak and Landing's reconstruction, except proportionally it's different. It's got a much longer, narrower trunk with narrower, longer branches at the top. More uncertain is what was happening at the bottom. We have a base from Prototaxites, from Prototaxites hefteri, but this is a much, much smaller species, but it shows basically a holdfast-like base with multiple, what I'm going to call rhizomorphs, extending out a bit like the base of a tree trunk. And these branched and extended outwards, and based on other specimens which are presumed to be from Prototaxites, it produced multiple orders of smaller and smaller rhizomorphs, which branched out, were straight or sinuous, and followed the surface of the substrate. While this wasn't a fungus most likely anymore, it is vaguely comparable to the rhizomorphs of Amylaria, which is a modern fungus. Yeah, so that's the basic reconstruction here. I have restored it as upright because rhizomorphs do not produce branches in a very low angle from in multiple planes. They would either produce low angle branches in a single plane, or they would produce very high angle branches, probably on the underside. Think about roots and having to bury itself through the soil. It wouldn't work with this anatomy. Yeah. Next, there is one more species, well, two more species we can potentially restore, which is a much smaller one. This one's only 45 centimeters tall. Prototaxites onigiri is the oldest species we have from the Middle Ordovician. And again, it has a similar structure of an evenly branched top with a dichotomy at the very top, which was uneven. A ridged trunk, although this one was less sharply ridged. And yeah, it's very close, but a lot smaller than P. logani. The holdfast in this one I've restored based on P. hefteri. And another feature which I didn't talk about previously is that P. hefteri has been described with these weird, what were described as adhesive discs, which Schweitzer thought were terminal to the branches. However, as you can see from this specimen, it looks more like they were laterally branching off main rhizome axes, which is what I have restored here. We don't know what these were for, but they may have been sites where mycelium-like threads, so basically tiny root-like threads, connected the rhizomes to the ground. But it's very speculative. I am not entirely sure how to interpret this, because we have so little of it. And yeah, what we can be a little bit more certain on is the ecology of Prototaxites. I said before, it was a very early organism in terrestrial terms. It appeared in the Ordovician and disappeared at the end of the Devonian. And for most of that time, it was the largest terrestrial organism, growing way, way above anything else surrounding it. Based on multiple papers and also isotopic analyses, it has been suggested that it lived in very close proximity to water, so along the borders of riverbanks or around floodplain lakes, things like that. And it's been suggested that it may have gained most of its nutrients from algal sources, which again would have been in the water. Interestingly, also, based on its modern fossil distribution, it would have been a mostly equatorial species, or at least it wasn't found at very high latitudes. However, again, this might be a sampling bias. but it could suggest that it was a mainly tropical, subtropical taxon. We have evidence of potential feeding on prototaxites. We have coprolites from the early Devonian, or was it the Silurian? I think it was the early Devonian, which have prototaxites like tubules within them. And yeah, these are suggested to be from millipedes, so it potentially was eaten by things. A final very interesting thing is that it may have acted as nuclei for wildfires. It was by far the tallest organism in its environment, so lightning potentially struck it and caused it to set on fire, and explains why we have incredibly hot fires up to over 700 degrees centigrade known from the Silurian, which would not be achieved with just 20 to 30 centimeter tall plants. So instead, prototaxites likely set on fire and just could have appeared as these giant flaming columns burning internally. But yeah. Probably the next bit, which a lot of people will find interesting, is speculations. So we do not know much about prototaxites. I've dug through everything, and there's very little that we can concretely say about it. But yeah, the largest specimen we have is over a meter in diameter. It's absolutely gigantic, especially compared to the previous full reconstruction I showed. And if it followed the same proportions, the same mathematics as we would expect for P. lagani and also other modern vascular trees and stuff, which was used as a comparison, it would be over 20 meters tall. I personally don't know if that seems reasonable. That's exceptionally tall for something that was feeding saprophytically on the detritus of surrounding organisms in a time when we basically didn't even have proper soil. Instead, potentially, maybe it just grew to a certain height and then grew outwards, forming these rather stout but still tall, 8 meter tall columns, which were up to a meter wide and just incredibly large. But that's speculative. We do not know. Like I said before, the rhizomorphs of prototaxites are not very well understood. Potentially, they were very spreading, forming large network communities. But we don't have direct evidence of that. But also we have these weird adhesive discs showing that there was some specialization to maybe adhesion to potentially different substrates. But yeah, we don't have that much direct evidence. So speculate. Within reason, there is room for speculation. Another thing which we cannot really comment on with any certainty is coloration. They were saprophytic based on isotopic evidence. They were not photosynthetic, as a lichen identity would suggest. That's just been mostly discounted now. So what colours would they have been? We don't have any modern direct comparisons. But at least ecologically, being multicellular terrestrial saprotrophs, fungi might be the best comparison we have ecologically. So yeah, you could use fungi as inspiration for the coloration. However, the caveat to that is a lot of modern ecologies which affect fungal coloration, such as bright coloration might be to deter predators from eating it, doesn't work back then. The environment was so fundamentally different that many ecological pressures just did not exist back then. So I cannot really help with the coloration, apart from potentially saying that the rhizomorphs may have been dark in color, purely because they may have been filled with nasty chemicals, melanin-like compounds, tannin-like compounds, which were used to deter predation, basically make them toxic so they don't get eaten by things which can reach them. Another interesting thing, because we don't know their coloration...
Oh, Jules, you have only a few minutes left.
That's perfect. Is they may have been bioluminescent, or at least that is a potential speculation you could make. fungi are bioluminescent, but we do not know why. We do not know the ecological pressures that cause it. But multiple eukaryote groups throughout the eukaryote tree have bioluminescence. So while it's very speculative, it is an option. So you could potentially draw prototaxites as being bioluminescent. And yeah, that is it. We've gone from basically prototaxites being a conifer to some kind of algae to a fungus. We ignore the liverwort mat, to maybe being a lichen, but now it seems more likely that it's an extinct eukaryote group which we haven't previously identified. And yeah, that was very quick, but thank you very much.